So I'll give you just a little bit of my background. I spent many years at Procter & Gamble. I spent the first half of my career in brand management marketing in the US and in Western Europe. And I spent the second half of my career standing up P&G's global business development organization, which built collaborations with outside entities. As part of that, I was privileged to be involved with the formation of Centrifuge before it was even called Centrifuge. So I've had a chance to see the critical role that Centrifuge has played and continues to play in the local ecosystem. I had the chance to take early retirement about 5 years ago, and I started up my consulting practice in which I help big companies and small companies talk to each other. But one of the other things that I did going on 5 years ago is I joined Queen City Angels, because I saw the role that angel investors play in driving entrepreneurship and in supporting startups and driving economic development. And I've been delighted with my involvement with Queen City Angels since then. In terms of the role that many angels play in coaching and developing, I wanted to share that we did a survey about a year ago asking how our members spend their time. At that time, we had about 60 members. We've doubled that now. We have about a little over 115. And interestingly, we found that on average, our members spent 20,000 hours a year in the community. Now, some of that was involved with our core investing work of due diligence and screening and things like that. But a good chunk of those 20,000 hours spent by our members were actively involved in coaching, developing, mentoring founders, many of whom might never end up becoming a Queen City Angels portfolio company, but it's still a really important role that we and many of the other ecosystem partners try to play here in the Startup Cincy ecosystem. So that's my background. Delighted to be here, and I'll flip it to Sue to give her background, and then she'll get us going.
So I kind of joke that I'm actually an accidental angel investor. If you had asked me 5-6 years ago if I would be doing this, I probably would have laughed at you. Like Steve, I started my career at P&G. I worked in global innovation. And then I spent the second chapter of my career at a boutique consulting firm called Spencer Hall that focused on uncovering deep consumer insights and using that to help clients develop their innovation portfolios. And now about 6 years ago, I started my own consulting business, Power Within, and I help clients with uncovering the key customer insights they need to either set their business strategy or their innovation strategy. So during my work as a consultant, Power Within, I was doing some strategy work with the University of Cincinnati, and that is where I met Tony Shipley. He was on the board that I was working with there, and he liked what I did to help them with some strategy development. This was their UCRI board, so it was at the interface of academia and industry, and said, hey, our angel group could use a strategy refresh. And I said, well, I know very little about angel investing, but sometimes that's an advantage. Sometimes a fresh set of eyes, somebody who can come in and help you to get the insights from your stakeholders to help you take things to the next level. So as I started working with Queen City Angels, initially they were a client of mine. One thing led to another, and I learned a lot about angel investing and learned that it was something that I did want to get involved in. So I went from zero involvement to suddenly getting involved with Queen City Angels, as well as with some additional angel investing groups. Tony introduced me to Alicia Robb, who was starting a Rising Tide program nationally, trying to encourage more women to get involved in angel investing, because that was one of my new insights, was how few women were involved in the way, and that was potentially disadvantaging female entrepreneurs. So I joined Queen City Angels. I joined this Rising Tides training program, and that eventually led to me also joining something called Next Wave Impact, which is focused on investing in companies that have positive social environmental impact. So I went from no involvement in angel investing to a lot of involvement in angel investing. One of the aspects I learned about angel investing, can flip to this next slide. One of the things I learned as I was doing the work with Queen City Angels is, why do people become involved in angel investing? And certainly there is a wealth creation element, return on capital. But it's a high risk, high reward, something that you don't put all your money into angel investing. But There are a lot easier ways to make just money if that's all you care about. But the reason people were involved was in terms of the value of assisting entrepreneurs, being able to have that opportunity to coach, advise, and mentor them. Is also a great way to just simply, stay involved, because you learn as much from the entrepreneurs as they learn from you. So that ability to stay engaged and experience that continuous learning was another big factor. And then finally, just building on what Steve said, it's a great way to give back. A lot of economic growth and development comes from smaller companies growing, and a lot of angels were involved for that reason, and that was very inspirational to me as well. So that's just a little bit about my background. Just a little story about one of my early engagements in mentoring in the ecosystem. Queen City Angels does a lot of work with our local accelerators, particularly helping them prepare for pitch practice. So if you turn back the clock about 3 years ago, I was part of a group of Queen City Angels who were helping Ocean with their then with their cohort pitch practice. And I met Kirsten Moorfield and Darren Murner, who were the co-founders of Cloverleaf. And as part of the feedback and discussion, I was really intrigued by what they were offering, but had some tips and things that I gave them. And we just started developing a relationship. I offered to, do some follow-up. Kirsten took me up on it, led to a series of mentoring engagements, ultimately led to them being both screened and invested in by Queen City Angels. And now I'm part of their board. So you never know where it's going to lead. Doesn't always lead there, but it's been exciting to be alongside them as they've been growing and developing their company. So I think I'm shifting back to you, Nick.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So working with entrepreneurs, here are a few thoughts, and thank you for the things that have come in on the chat so far. It looks like some folks have had some experience in doing this, which is great, and many folks have not yet. So we have a range, and that's terrific. We'll try to give, particularly the folks who haven't had much experience with coaching and mentoring, some advice on how to do that and do that effectively. So this is all about adding value. Coaching, mentoring, and also making meaningful connections. I'm sure many of you would agree that connections can be some of the most valuable ways that we can help startups and founders. How can you give them a warm introduction? But in terms of coaching and mentoring, a few of the underlying principles that we want to share. First, seek to understand. Determine their needs. Don't assume that they will generally be very, very forthcoming with, here are the 2 or 3 things that are keeping me up at night. And then try to find a link between what those things are and where your background and your experience can help them the most. And we'll talk through how to make those links a little bit more. This is also an opportunity to really build confidence. I can't think of much that is more difficult than standing up a new company. It is a 24/7, 365, lay it all on the line venture. And they know that many of them aren't going to succeed. Most of the data suggests that about half of startups will fail. And so it's very high risk enterprise for them. So giving them confidence and finding the things they are doing that you can underscore with your experience and say, that feels dead right. If I were in your shoes, that's exactly what I would be doing, goes a long way, balanced with, here are 2 or 3 things that you might want to think about. And that goes to coaching with careful questions. So we know that there are, a lot of folks on this call who might be in big enterprises. Sue and I both come out of P&G initially. So, many of us have worked or do work today in organizations that have an abundance of resources. Startups are the exact opposite. It's absolute scarcity for them. So that way, ensuring careful questioning will allow you to figure out where you can add the most value. And rather than imposing on them a solution that might be appropriate at a big co, you can help lead them to how, with scarce resources, they can perhaps come out with, the research or the knowledge that they need. And then finally, making meaningful connections. There is little that is more powerful for a startup than a warm introduction. So if you know somebody who could be a prospective customer, or even somebody who could be an advisor or somebody with whom they can bounce off their value proposition in order to learn, are they in the right ballpark? Those are incredibly valuable. So thinking about warm introductions that you can make to say, hey, I know so-and-so, here's a startup that I've been talking to. I think they have something really exciting, but they need some help. They'd like to bounce a few things off of you. Would you give them 20 minutes of your time? It's hard for people to say no to that, and connections are just incredibly, incredibly valuable. We'll go through a couple more of the slides here, and then we'll take a pause. And Catherine, I think as you are also monitoring the chat, we'll let you jump in a couple slides with what you're seeing that folks want us to zone in on. So coaching and mentoring, just to drill down a bit on this a little bit. Understand their current needs. What type of help are they seeking? Is it connections? Is it help with their value proposition? Is it marketing and communications help? Is it help with staffing? A lot of times, startups will have identified that they have a key hire they need to make. They need to hire a sales director. They've never done that before. You may have great experience with identifying talent, interviewing, hiring, that might be very helpful. That's just one example where folks, particularly who come out of big co's, can really help. Sue and I always find it's very helpful to understand the milestones that our entrepreneurs that we are mentoring are going through. What are the next couple most critical things that they need to get done, that they need to get accomplished? You can't boil the ocean, you can't get everything done, but if you can help them understand or help tease out from your conversations with them what really matters in the next manageable time horizon, the next week, the next month, helping them focus on getting those things done is incredibly helpful. One of the things that probably many of us on this call have seen is that how critical focus is if you are a startup. Obviously, startups, as we said, have got very scarce resources, and many times they'll get pulled in lots of different directions. They'll see a shiny object that might be a new line of business that they want to pursue before they've really focused on their core. So helping them focus and being very, very efficient in their time and in the costs that they might incur is really helpful. And then the final thing on this slide that I want to underscore, and I would say this is one of the top few things that you might want to take away, is understand your unique ability to add value. And for many people, this tends to fall into one of three buckets. And these are overlapping, but it could be industry specific. So if you have spent your career in banking and you are coaching a fintech startup, your experiences in that industry can be incredibly valuable. You've probably seen things over a decade or two that you're able to share to demystify the industry. What are the key drivers and what are the washouts? So industry specific lens is one of the key ones that people find usually a really, really good way to form a linkage between what you have and what the founders are needing. The other is skill specific. You may be an outstanding market researcher, and so therefore you can leverage your extensive experience in doing market research to help a founder understand, well, how can they really inexpensively begin to do customer discovery? Or how can they begin to figure out the best way to articulate their value proposition? So you're leveraging some of what you have learned over many years in your specific area of expertise that can help them. That might also lead to connections as well that you might point out. So that's the second lens. And then the third one is general business. Sometimes founders will be people who have been around the block. They have either come out of big co's themselves or they've done other startups. Other times, these may be people who have recently graduated from university or don't have a whole lot of just general business experience, but they have a great deal of passion and they have a great idea for a product or service that they're looking to commercialize. So think about the sort of scars and gold stars that you have been able to amass in your career that are in a general business sense where you can help them. You can, for example, help them with the understanding the critical importance of having the right sort of financial dashboard set up so that they understand what their spending is, what their customer acquisition looks like. That might not be something that they would typically think about, but you may have done that just like breathing over the course of your many years of experience. So you can leverage that general business lens to help them. So again, industry specific expertise, skill specific expertise, and general business expertise tend to be the three ways that you can find the best way to drive a connection between a startup founder and what you can bring to the party. Sue, I think we're going to you next, but do we want to do a check for questions?
Why don't we do a check-in? I'm just going to build on what you said around the fundamental business part. I'm not sure how many folks in the audience have done any looking at the lean startup information from Eric Ries, but there's some fundamental, there's a model around the fundamental business building pillars that that entrepreneurs need to be thinking about. The desirability, who are the customers, who are the humans you need to really understand to have a viable business. What is the feasibility? What can you create that will create, value for them? And then viability, which is what's the business model whereby you can collect, value and have a sustainable business for that. And so even just bringing entrepreneurs back to some of those fundamentals and having them recognize that's an iterative process. You've got to consistently be looking at all three of those things and how do they come together can be really helpful for them. And for those of you who haven't, I would highly recommend maybe doing some, if you don't have a lot of experience with entrepreneurs yet, one of the things you can do is Eric Ries has a lot of resources. He wrote the book, The Lean Startup. There's a lot of free resources available around that can help you just get some of those fundamentals down.
Great.
So yeah, before we transition into talking about this coaching and mentoring philosophy, let's take a couple of questions.
Catherine, if you can unmute, and do you have one or two theme areas that seem to be coming through that you could put forth?
Yeah, I have a specific question here regarding individual areas of expertise. I'm not sure how much I should do. I'm a good writer. Is it okay to offer to write strategy docs or copy for them? Or should I focus on just being a consultant?
Sure, that's a great question. Great question. And I think the broad that fits under the broad question of truly how much do you do for them. So clearly, I think the approach that Sue and I tend to use is you're trying to teach people to fish rather than fishing for them. But you may end up having to, and it's wonderful if you have the capacity to lean in and help them with, okay, if I were doing a strategy based upon what you've told me about your startup, here are some thoughts of what might be in your strategy pillar. Or you might say, here's an example of a strategy from another company I've worked with, so you can have a good example. Why don't you, founder, go away and take a bash, and I will give you my thoughts on that. So it's always a fine line. What I usually tend to find is doing a little bit for them, particularly if they don't have, in this case, strategy, they don't have a lot of experience with that. Doing a little bit with them to do kind of a guided discussion is great. But then you have given them some of the principles and skills that they can then reapply. So you haven't given them the answer. I would, just to wrap up, in general, I'd really try to shy away from ever in these sessions saying, here's what I think the answer is, because I don't have as much information about the business as they do. So I generally try to encourage people, don't get sucked into doing too much, because you may not have all the information. You might lead them astray unintentionally. So it's best if you can have a guided discussion, doing a little bit for them, but then teaching them some of those skills in the process.
Yeah, I'll just build on that with an example. So one of my areas of personal expertise is customer insight discovery. So when I'm talking to entrepreneurs and trying to help them how to better understand, their customers, I will talk to them about some of the mindsets and some of the principles and some general types of information you need to deeply understand and empathize with your customer. I might then do a quick demonstration of how to do a customer insight discovery session. And that might be just 5 minutes where I have them play the role of a customer and I interview them, right? So I just give them that little bit of an example of what it looks like, and then send them off to do some of their own and say, okay, we can touch base after you've talked to 5 customers, and you can, then share what you're learning, and, so you set some logical follow-up if they want it, if they need it. So that
Right.
just gives a specific example. So great. Other questions?
Catherine, yeah.
Yeah, great. That one was from Pete. So thank you, Pete. And then this one is from Ben. What are your tips to keep founders focused on most essential tasks?
Well, I think the first, back to our principle of and Sue's about to talk this more, but listening, ask them, right? And if, for example, you get the sense they really don't have a good sense of what needs to be done or the key tasks in front of them, that in and of itself is a coaching opportunity, because you can reflect back to them, hey, I'm not sure that you and your team have fully identified. Let me help you with the full range of things, and let's go through and have a conversation about trying to prioritize them. By contrast, if you ask the question and they pull out a sheet of paper that has, here are our deliverables for the next month, you can give them a lot of very positive feedback about having that already done. And then you can say, wow, that's a great list. Interesting. Point number 3, let me give you a build on that. So I would again always start with the, have you considered, how are you thinking about that? See what they have done. And then based upon that, you'll know whether you are in, I'm fine tuning mode, here's a little thing I can do to help them, or I'm in more fundamental coaching mode because they really don't even know how to approach the prioritization of a work plan.
Yeah. And a lot of times you can go, just building on that, you can go back to that fundamental desirability, feasibility, viability model and help understand what's the hypothesis you think is most important to test now? How are you thinking about testing that hypothesis, whatever it might relate to, and use that as, again, a framework to determine how to keep them, how to ask the right questions to help them stay focused.
That's great. And then just one final comment on that. As I'm sure folks have probably participated in other content from Cintrifuse that is particularly focused on what entrepreneurs need to pay attention to, reflect back on some of that learning, because, as an example, one of the things you'll hear is that it's a watch out for entrepreneurs to fall in love with their solution. They really need to fall in love with their customer's problem and then figure out, do they have the right solution? So again, as you are thinking back to the things you may have learned in some of these other sessions about what entrepreneurs need to be thinking about, if you get the sense to this question about prioritization that they have fallen in love with their solution and aren't spending time truly understanding their customer's problem, that also gives you an entree to give them some of that, coaching that they may have missed.
Awesome.
Any others, or before we move on? Yeah.
We can do one more question. This one should be a quick answer for Todd. His question is, what is the frequency to meet with your startup?
Another great question. It depends. I think a lot of it depends on the depth of the relationship that you're in with your startup, and where and how you can help relative to other resources that they might be using. So over the last 4 or 5 years that I've been doing this, Steve had me add it up. It was actually a scary number. I've probably talked to 100 entrepreneurs in the last couple of years. However, some of those conversations have been one-time, one-off, 15 to 30 minute discussions, and some of them have been in a lot more depth. And a lot of it depends on, from both sides, how much value are you willing to give, do they want from you, and how much are you willing to give, and what type of relationship so there is no single answer. It really comes back to that decision process, how much you want to give and how much are you going to be able to provide to them, and then what sort of frequency makes sense relative to the milestones and things that they are challenged with. So there will be situations where I actually might meet with an entrepreneur for an hour, 3 weeks in a row at a particular critical point, and another situation where I might not talk to an entrepreneur for 3 or 4 months because they're working out something else, some other aspect of the business, and I'm not going to be the one adding value at that point. Okay.
Okay. All right, great.
All
Well,
right.
keep the questions
Yes.
coming,
Great
and
questions.
Catherine will check in with you in a few more slides.
So we've touched on this next slide just talks a little bit about kind of the overall philosophy, and we've touched on some of these points already. But I think one of the main things is that while you're in this coaching and mentoring process, is that you should be listening at least as much, if not more, than you're talking. Right? Startup founders have a wealth of information. They know their business in much more depth and detail than anyone else. You need to listen to what they're saying, listen to where they're directing you, that they want help, and then using, the questioning process to help them rethink or consider some things in a different way. You need to make sure you're not falling into the trying to sell them your way of thinking. You're more trying to expand their way of thinking. Also, I have found I've learned so much from entrepreneurs. So if you start getting into more and more of these discussions, you will learn things that you can transfer from one entrepreneur to another and get really high value. And sometimes directing entrepreneurs to help other entrepreneurs can be a win-win too. So for example, one of the companies that I work with was really brilliant at identifying ways of obtaining non-dilutive funding for their startup through military grants and things. And they had figured out that process and how to get access to that. And then there was another company that was considering how to get some research and development funding and looking for non-dilutive sources. And I was able to use the learning I had from one company to help another, and that's now been paid forward a number of times. So you can learn, you can help them from that standpoint. And then, I think Steve covered this already, the ability to assess what you're bringing from your personal experiences and your skill sets, but also not overstepping, right? If you know that you are not the person who is an expert in a certain area, but you can direct the entrepreneur to a better resource, and that resource can be another individual, it can be a book, it can be a website, whatever you think is going to be the best way for them to get value, you should not hesitate to do that. And then I think we already talked about the connections. That one's a pretty straightforward and obvious one. And use your discretion. There are some entrepreneurs that I feel really good about. I feel like they're very they listen, they're coachable, they're taking the information in and leveraging it in very powerful ways. I'll be more inclined, and they show gratitude and appreciation for that. Not that they take all my ideas, but that they listen well and they're doing great things. Those are the entrepreneurs I'm more likely to be willing to make additional connections for. On the other hand, I've occasionally run into an entrepreneur who's so in love with what they're already doing that even though they claim they're coming to ask for help, they're pretty closed-minded as to what they want to do next, and that's fine. I'll spend less time and I'll be less inclined to make connections for them. It just happens. So finally, and we've got two slides, these next two that kind of work together. The first side is the positive side. If you think about what we've heard from entrepreneurs, and this is not just our experience, but what we've heard from the entrepreneurs that we've worked with, is this is what it looks like to be a helpful coach and mentor. That first understanding, the need to be candid. So it's not that you can't ask challenging questions and you can't call out things that might be an area of concern, but it's the way that you do that. And if you do that from the standpoint of really caring about the success, if you know them as a person, if you understand them, and it's framed from the point of caring about whether caring about their success, and you have that relationship, you can be candid and call some things out, but you want to do it in a really respectful way. You don't want to be breaking down their confidence. You don't want to be discouraging them. You just want to be helping direct them, or helping them determine where they need to shift or change direction. As Steve said, the entrepreneurial life is a challenging one. So there's times where you just need to listen and be supportive. Sometimes bad things happen to entrepreneurs, setbacks, challenges, and just being able to be there for support at times is really the best thing you can do. Not giving advice, but just helping support them through challenges. The current environment with COVID, the entrepreneurs that we're working with, we've had everything from some whose businesses are taking off because they just so happen to be at a point where they're, this whole move to virtual was very positive for them. We have others who, their entire marketing plans were based on face-to-face conferences over the last year. So they need different kinds of support in those different situations. I think we already talked about the curiosity and the questions and the respect for resources. So I think we've covered the rest of this.
Okay.
And then the next is kind of the opposite side. Actually, smart entrepreneurs are gathering input from multiple mentors and coaches. What that means is they are also going to get different points of view that they weigh out and consider when they make decisions as to what's happening. So you need to recognize yours is not going to be the only the voice in their ear, and that they're smart, they're gathering and looking for themes. So, be careful about, or just keeping that in mind and not being overly pushing one directive or another, just allowing them to take in what you have to say and to weigh it out. You could also ask them questions about, how does what I'm telling you fit with what you're hearing from others? Again, a way to get learning back and forth and a way to get balance. Also, even your best attempt to add value, there's something that's called adding too much value, right? Trying to provide too much information, too much at the same time. As mentioned earlier, focus is so critical. So do it in bite-sized pieces. Focus on what's most important to them. And recognizing that yes, money is a precious resource, as is their time. So making sure you're not stretching out. If you make a decision to get together with an entrepreneur and you finish what's important and valuable in 15 minutes, you end the discussion and let them get on with it. And then finally, and this is a real watch out for some of us who are more seasoned and have perhaps been working in the industry for a longer period of time. You may not be as familiar with the target customer or the market or whatever as your entrepreneur is, and making sure that you're watching out and not giving them out of date knowledge or information.
If I could just jump
Yes.
in, I just saw Ann Mooney, who's a colleague of ours at Queen City Angels, had jumped into the chat with a comment on that. And Ann, if I saw it correctly, I think it was, don't be afraid to admit that you don't know, or that your tapes are not terribly current on something. Back to Sue's earlier point, you'll learn something about that. And you may actually find that there are some core principles that haven't changed too much. It may be that marketing is very different today than it was 15 years ago, which it is, but some of the core principles around marketing strategy and target audience identification are just as relevant in a digital world today as they were in a print and TV world, exclusively 15 years ago. So Ann, thanks for that build.
And then I think, to finish off this slide is that you want to be cognizant of what you are able and willing to give to entrepreneurs. And that might be time, that might be, talent, that might be connections. Just be honest and open what you can and can't do at any given point in time. Certainly we all have situations where we have availability and can provide things, and times where we cannot. But don't promise something that you can't deliver, because that's that's very hard on entrepreneurs. It can be a real letdown if you say, oh yes, I will do X, Y, Z, and then you don't follow through. So that's a final watch out here.
And yeah, I think that's a great list, Sue. And just before we go on to the next slide, just from my personal experience, having been at P&G for 32 years, where I was surrounded by more resources than I comprehended, I really had to adjust my framing and talking to entrepreneurs where they do have scarce resources, scarce money, scarce time, just scarcity everywhere. And actually, I have to say, I learned a lot from that, because boy, if they didn't have some really smart ways of very efficiently figuring out, whether copy A or copy B led to better customer acquisition in a really, really smart and efficient way. So it was really a great two-way street.
They've learned to be scrappy, and it's great.
So there's been a little bit of back and forth on kind of how on the chat, which is great, on how do you get started. So these last couple slides, we're going to talk a little bit of what's going on in the ecosystem, and after we get through these next two slides, then John or Catherine, if you have some thoughts that you want to jump in from your centrifuge standpoint, please feel free. But you know, this really tries to address the question of how might I get started? Where might I plug myself in to help? And we are very fortunate here in the Startup Cincy ecosystem to have lots and lots of resources. That infographic that you can see on the right, obviously you can't read it, you're not intended to, but you can go to the Centrifuge website. It's a terrific listing of all of the different nodes and resources that there are, kind of arrayed along the spectrum of the life of a startup. So it's a really, really neat tool that our Centrifuge friends pulled together, and you might want to take a look at that. Some of the entities you'll see on there are places where you can plug yourself in. HCDC is a wonderful both physical and educational resource. Aviatra, importantly focused on female founders. They do an excellent job of linking their portfolio companies and people who are in the ecosystem with sources of support. Hillman, who is supporting underrepresented entrepreneurs, as well as Mortar, are both two great places to plug yourself in. And then we, of course, have some of the accelerators. We've got Ocean, we've got Brand Regenerator.
And then the university-based ones.
And then we have some that are based out of the universities as well. So we haven't listed everything because we just didn't have space. These are some of the examples of where you can plug yourself in. And I just want to reflect back to Sue's story about the company called Cloverleaf that she met at a pitch session. One of the easy next steps that you could do would be to attend a demo day for one of these entities. They're currently being done virtually. Hopefully in the future, we'll be back to doing them in person. And then particularly when it's in person, at the end of it, when they have their social mingling, go up to a founder who did a presentation on something that you found particularly interesting or where you think you have a connection. Introduce yourself and simply make the offer. Say, hey, listen, you appear to be playing in the digital advertising space. Here's my background. Here's my business card. If I can help, I'd be happy to have coffee. Even just that little step is a great way to get started. If you've never done this before, do that. I think you'll find that the water's warm and people are very, very appreciative of folks reaching out. So these are some of the ones in the ecosystem. We also just wanted to highlight some of the specific engagement opportunities that Queen City Angels, in partnership with some of our local ecosystem partners, offer. E-Kickstart is an educational series, hour-long sessions on particular topics. Morning mentoring is a great one for people to show up. If you haven't been to one of those before, you could show up. You could simply audit the course initially, and then you might want to jump in. It provides an easy way to do one-time coaching in the context of a pitch for startups at an early stage. And then you can also, in terms of resources, you can direct the folks that you might talk to reach out to Queen City Angels. The Entrepreneur Bootcamp is a 2-day session that we provide to help jumpstart entrepreneurs at an early stage. These are just a few of the resources that are available that you can direct startups to in the course of your mentoring and coaching with them. But there are also many, many others that are out there, and Centrifuge is a great connective tissue to sort of curate the things that are there. All right, that provides the content. I want to make sure that John and Catherine have the opportunity to jump in if they have thoughts in terms of making connections within the ecosystem, and then additional questions that have come through on the chat.
Great, yeah, I did see another question come through from Todd, so I'll go ahead and ask that, and then John can kind of pop in and provide more insight from Centrifuge. So this question is around charging for your time. I see 3 avenues that this could work: gratis, or charging for a percentage of equity. How much is appropriate? and then an hourly charge. Can you expand on these or any other methods that have worked for you?
So most of what we're talking about here is where we've done, free coaching and mentoring. So the majority of what we do through our work with Queen City Angels, through our work with universities, where we're interacting a lot with students. I mean, recognizing that startup founders don't have a lot of spare cash is mostly, giving away time. It's part of a community give back for us, majority time. However, there can be some circumstances where there's a startup that has a particular need for an expertise, where a deeper relationship might make sense. So I think both of us, we've done situations where we've done uh, a swap of services. So I did some more extensive coaching for a startup that then helped me with developing a website, or helped me with, refreshing my PowerPoint template or something. So sometimes there are some in-kind swaps that make sense. So those are pretty entrepreneur friendly. And then there may be other times where it does make sense to do an actual engagement for consulting services. And I have done those as well. Try to keep startup friendly rates, and conscious about that, and keep an open mind to unique business models such as equity. But I think those are only in unique circumstances where there's really truly extensive long-term advisory value that you're offering to a startup, because you're asking quite a bit from them to give away equity. So it needs to be the right value prop on both sides. So you see, that's a spectrum. Hopefully that helps answer the question. But yeah, going out and starting out as I'm going to be a consultant to startups. That's a little bit difficult to do when they're really cash strapped. You really have to learn your way to understand the value proposition.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
just a quick build on that in terms of advisory. It can evolve, coaching if you've got to build a relationship and you've got a particular skill set. Sometimes startups will have a council of advisors or something like that, and they might give a quarter point of equity to 3 to 5 people who serve in that capacity. So that's not unusual. It's not common, but it's not unusual. It does happen. So it's a very, very nominal equity portion, and it generally is in compensation for meeting quarterly, making some introductions, doing some degree of advising for them on a regular basis. So that certainly is something that can happen, and there are precedents for that.
Okay, yeah, that kind of relates to Anne's question on how and when do you make the transition to a paid relationship. So, all right, are there any other questions, or we can move on to John?
Yeah, and so I threw a link to the virtual Ocean demo day into the group chat there, which is a great example. They did a fantastic job kind of pivoting and producing that this year. We see more of those. Flywheel had a great program that wrapped up in the spring, and I believe we'll have one out in the fall. So there are lots of opportunities to get involved. I'm John Steger with Centrifuge. My full-time job is working with startups. So I also threw my email address in the chat. Feel free to reach out if you would like to get involved. In terms of consulting for a fee, I would say it's probably not something to start out with in mind. And generally, I would say, granted, I get paid to do this, but that's pretty transparent at the outset, and it's funded by Centrifuge in the state. But I think if you go into the kind of relationships with a spirit of giving, and then at some point the time request is more than you have to give, that's the time to be pretty transparent about that. Or if you feel like there's a great kind of fit and you want to talk about something more permanent and more time, I would kind of tend to raise it that way. We work with a couple hundred startups in the greater Cincinnati area. There are certainly more than that. Everybody from folks doing true deep software, that is developer tools, to trying to kind of reinvent the retail experience. A whole bunch of opportunities to get involved. One of the reasons we wanted to put this on today is we're always eager to grow our bench or coalition of the willing, either to work through our organization or others, and having, frankly, folks that have spent more time kind of being deliberate and thinking about how they can add value and why they want to add value is really an asset. So.
All right, we have one more question that came through. Also want to mention that I dropped a survey link in the chat. So before exiting, we would be really appreciative if we got some feedback on the session, which will be shared with Steve and Sue. So this one is from Christine. How have you partnered with a startup's advisors, knowing that some have a more active role in the business?
Could you just say that one more time?
Yeah. How have you partnered with a startup's advisors, knowing that some have a more active role in the business?
Right. So if we understand the question, there might be advisors who have a more formal role for a startup, but those advisors in turn may need additional support. It might make sense for you, in addition to providing coaching and mentoring for the founder, to perhaps engage with his or her advisors. That's perfectly appropriate. That certainly can be done. So if it is a particular life science startup that has a medical advisory board, and you don't want to be on the board, you don't have time for that, but you've got great experience in medical devices, there could easily be a connection either with the founder and or with other people who have a more formal relationship to, again, grab coffee and help with whatever they're grappling with that you might be able to bring a one-time piece of information or perspective to. And then again, that could obviously grow into something else. I think the one thing that our discussion hopefully is underscored is these are very organic. There isn't one playbook and there isn't one path these necessarily take. In some cases, it'll be a one-off 30-minute coffee and you'll never talk to them again. And that's fine. You will have made some very, very important deposits in their emotional bank account. In some, there may be one where you really hit it off and you decide you want to have lunch once a month, and it is a drumbeat of added value after added value and everything in between. So these things take a lot of different shapes, but there is nothing to say that coaching and advising can't be directed to the founder, to other members of the founder's team, as well as other advisors who might be in the orbit of the company. All of those things are possible and perfectly appropriate.
All right, great. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if anyone has any last minute asks, please submit them now.
Yeah, while you're doing that, one other thing struck me. So one of the things that happened as soon as I changed my LinkedIn profile to show that I was an angel investor was that I started getting outreach from all kinds of entrepreneurs from all over the place. So you do want to think through who you're going to respond to and who you're not going to respond to. One of the things I found was helpful is, first of all, being clear if you are an investor, and some of the people on this call may be investors and some may not, but being upfront with the entrepreneur one way or the other. If you are an investor, being clear on what your thesis is, and if the entrepreneur has approached you and it's, you want to be clear whether that you would consider them for funding or not consider them for funding. Almost every first conversation I'll have with an entrepreneur is I will say, this is not about funding. This, conversation can't be about funding. If there's something else I can help you with, then I'll be happy to have the conversation. And then I'm pretty clear about how I'm investing, which funds, what's the process, that sort of thing. And I really, I've found that to be helpful, particularly when I get outreach from people who I don't know, have no connection to, being really clear about that. If you are an investor, but you're approached by somebody and you're willing to help them, they're looking for advice, and you recognize that they might be looking in the wrong places for investment, that is something that you can really help founders with, not spending or wasting a lot of time applying for investment with organizations where it's not a good match. And so again, I would turn back to Cintrifuse. They do a really good job of advising, and those of you who are just getting into this, familiarizing yourselves with the various sources of capital. The map that Cintrifuse has created provides information about that, and that's something that you can really help entrepreneurs save a lot of time and energy and focus on the right things by helping them navigate that piece of the startup process.
Okay. I saw this one from earlier. I know we kind of addressed keeping startup focused on their tasks, but this one is more around founders often receive conflicting advice or too much advice that can distract them from their core focus. How can coaches help filter out the noise and keep them focused? And that one's from Eric.
Yeah. So I think that comes back to this principle of helping them have a strategy about their most important hypotheses or most important milestones. So you may have to pull them back a little bit to ask them, hey, what are the top 3 things that are most important to you and your business right now? And have them filter advice around those key topics and then think through, okay, who has the best advice about this priority area for me? Because some people are very, very free with giving advice, even when they don't necessarily have an area of expertise, versus the point we said before, which is be really clear about where you can and can't add value. Not everybody will do that for them. So anyhow, bringing them back to evaluate the sources of the advice they're getting against what they really need to be doing.
And I think that also brings in the principle of the difference between advice and direction, because I have no problem if I'm giving advice and an entrepreneur chooses to do something different. If I feel like I've been heard and I've given them something to think about and they make an intelligent, different choice, it's her company. Who am I to say that's wrong? So I also, if an entrepreneur is getting multiple and sometimes conflicting pieces of advice and you're coaching her, ask the question, are you being given direction or are you being given counsel, right? Because, she may think she heard, well, you have to go do X, and maybe she did, but that's, again, we try very much not to be prescriptive when we're giving coaching. Unless you really see something's about to go off the rails, it's far better to, here are 3 things for you to think about and let them sort their way through it in a very directed way. So that can be another way to sort out that conflicting pieces of feedback, which does happen. Catherine, I think you have our email coordinates, so I don't know if you feel free to share that with the attendees if you'd like, and for folks on the call, you can find us on LinkedIn, or Catherine, if you share our emails, we are more than happy to talk to anybody as a follow-up if you have questions or looking for connections or anything we can do to help you in your journey for helping entrepreneurs. Please don't hesitate to reach out if we can do anything.